Some stories don't start with a ribbon cutting or a press release. They start quietly like a small group unlocking the doors of an abandoned school, simply because they believed kids deserve more than just a seat in a classroom. Today, I want to tell you about a place called Freedom School, a school where no one's forced to fit in, and where voices that used to be ignored finally get heard. If you've ever wondered whether a small classroom can actually make a difference, stay with me. It started with a whisper, then a text, then a storm. On an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, in the beige-walled classroom of room 108 at Shady Grove Elementary, Ms. Evers stood with a dry erase marker in hand, guiding her fifth graders through a lesson on American history. Her curly black hair was pulled into a high bun, a habit she'd kept from her Navy days. Her voice, warm and even, carried over the quiet hum of pencils scratching paper and pages turning. The board read, "Freedom, what does it really mean?" Little did she know, this simple question, asked with sincerity and intention, would be twisted into a headline, into a weapon. One of the students had gone home that day and repeated the discussion to her mother. Ms. Evers said America wasn't always fair to black people, she'd told her while sipping a juice box. The mother, a prominent PTA member and local real estate agent, took offense. She sent an email that night. CCD, the school board, the superintendent, 3 local news stations. The subject line read, "Critical race theory being taught to children." By Wednesday morning, it had made the rounds. By Thursday, the hate mail had begun. And by Friday, Ms. Evers was sitting in a makeshift administrative hearing, trying to explain how teaching about Harriet Tubman and the civil rights movement had somehow become grounds for dismissal. What they didn't know, what they never asked, was who Ms. Evers really was. They didn't know about her time in Kandahar, crawling under a burning vehicle to pull a fellow soldier out, or the nights she'd spent volunteering at shelters after retiring from the Navy, or how she'd once donated a kidney to a fellow teacher who didn't even have tenure. All they saw was her skin, her syllabus, and that word, dangerous. She could have fought back then, raised her voice, filed lawsuits. But Ms. Evers had learned something in war: never shoot too early. She would wait, quietly, until the truth stood beside her, and he was coming. Just not yet. The courtroom was full when the hearing officially began. 2 weeks later, Ms. Evers entered in a modest navy blue dress, hair pinned neatly, face calm. The room buzzed with murmurs, parents, teachers, media, activists, some cheering. Her, others jeering. The school board attorney, a sharp-jawed man in a tailored suit, began with, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to determine whether Ms. Evers has introduced divisive concepts into our classrooms, namely critical race theory." He used the term like it was a disease. Ms. Evers sat alone at her table. No lawyer, no union rep. Just a single manila folder and a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird tucked beneath it. The board played a recording of her lesson, conveniently clipped, devoid of context. They brought in parents who claimed their children felt shamed or confused. They displayed images of her classroom walls, posters of Ruby Bridges, Cesar Chavez, and yes, even Colin Kaepernick. Is this appropriate for 10-year-olds? The attorney asked, eyes flashing. Ms. Evers said nothing. Not yet. Then the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A man stepped in, tall, lean, maybe mid-30s. Dark suit, briefcase in hand. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. He hadn't seen her in 20 years. But he never forgot her voice. And he hadn't come just to watch. He had come to speak. His name was Jordan Bell, and once upon a time he was the boy no one believed in. No one but her. The first time Kiara stepped into the district administrative building with Ms. Evers, the air felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the sterile lighting that buzzed faintly overhead, the kind of buzz that filled in all the spaces where words failed. Maybe it was the hallway lined with black and white photos of former superintendents, all white, all male. staring down with a judgmental permanence. Or maybe it was just the stares. Every person who passed them in the hallway, secretaries, aides, a man in khakis carrying a clipboard, let their eyes linger a second too long on Ms. Evers. Not with curiosity, with calculation. The kind that measured how long she'd last. The kind that silently asked, why didn't she just keep her head down? They made their way into a small conference room. The walls were beige and bare, except for a framed quote from some leadership guru that read, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth." The irony was so thick Kiara nearly laughed. Miss Evers didn't. She sat at the far end of the long rectangular table, her posture composed but not rigid. She wore navy blue, the same color as the school's crest. Kiara sat beside her in a dark gray suit that still smelled faintly of plastic from the dry cleaner's bag. Across the table sat Mr. Ronald Beckman, Deputy Superintendent of Personnel. Middle-aged, ruddy cheeks, hair combed so tightly it looked painful. Beside him was a school board attorney named Charis Lindholm, sharp smile, sharper eyes. And behind them, in the corner like an afterthought, was a young white teacher with frizzy blonde hair and an expression of neutral discomfort. Ms. Dana Collins, third grade art. Ronald cleared his throat. Ms. Evers, thank you for coming. I know this must be unsettling. Unsettling is one word, Kiara replied. She was polite. But her voice had an edge to it that let the room know this wasn't going to be a passive conversation. Beckman continued. We've received several complaints from parents alleging that certain instructional content in your class may have violated district policy regarding political neutrality and cultural sensitivity. Kiara narrowed her eyes. What specifically did she say that violated those policies? Charis slid folder across the table. Inside were printed emails, anonymous of course, and a list of concerns compiled from parental feedback. It included words like divisive, Marxist, anti-American rhetoric. But the only direct quote attributed to Ms. Evers was, "Black history doesn't start with slavery, and white history doesn't start with the Constitution. We need to be honest about all of it." Kiara read it aloud, then set the page down slowly. That's the line that got her suspended? She asked. Beckman looked mildly uncomfortable. Well, in context. No, let's actually stay in context, Kiara said, her voice rising just enough. She was teaching the Greenwood Massacre, a historical event, verified by scholars, documented in textbooks. And she prefaced it with a line about honesty. That's your smoking gun? Charis interjected smoothly, like a well-trained crisis manager. Ms. Jackson, this isn't about whether the history is accurate. It's about how it was presented. One parent reported that their child came home crying because they were made to feel guilty for being white. Kiara raised an eyebrow. Did Ms. Evers say anyone should feel guilty? Silence. Ms. Evers spoke for the first time. I asked the class to imagine how it might feel, not to be punished for your skin, but to be punished because of it. I never said who should feel what. I let the truth do the talking. Dana Collins finally looked up from her coffee. Some of the kids. They said you called America a flawed nation. Ms. Evers turned to her. Because it is. That's not opinion. That's history. But I also said that we keep trying. That we move forward. That progress only happens when we tell the truth. Charis sighed, exasperated. The problem is perception. We live in a very polarized moment, and Kiara cut in. The problem is cowardice. You're afraid of parents. With Facebook groups and political agendas. You're not protecting kids. You're protecting yourselves. There was a long pause. Beckman straightened his tie. For now, Ms. Evers will remain on administrative leave. We are not terminating her, but the investigation is active. And we recommend she refrain from any contact with students or faculty. Then came the kicker. Also, he added, glancing awkwardly at a note in front of him, we've had to Cancel this year's Black History Month program. We feel that. Until the investigation concludes, it's best to avoid any additional scrutiny. The silence in the room thickened. Ms. Evers didn't move. Didn't blink. But Kiara saw it, the way her fingers curled slightly against her thigh. Like she was holding something back. I understand, she said quietly. You've already made your decision. No, Beckman said, too quickly. This is a process. No, she repeated. It's a performance. Outside the building, the media trucks were already lined up like vultures waiting for a stumble. Kiara placed a hand lightly on Ms. Evers' shoulder as they exited through the side door. It didn't help. The cameras found them anyway. Ms. Evers, did you really say white children should feel guilty? Are you teaching critical race theory in 5th grade? Do you regret what you said in class? Ms. Evers kept walking. Kiara blocked one reporter with her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Later that night, they sat together in the dim kitchen of Ms. Evers' small house. The blinds were drawn. A cup of chamomile tea sat untouched in front of her. I knew it would happen eventually, she said. I've been too lucky, too protected. You've been too good, Kiara replied. Ms. Evers chuckled bitterly. That's not what the world punishes. On the kitchen wall was a photo, framed in wood that was chipped on one corner, of her with her first 5th grade class. Mostly Black and Latino kids, some smiling too wide, some too shy. She reached up and touched the frame. They were the ones who taught me. I thought I was their teacher, but I learned more from them than they ever did from me. Kiara stared at her. Let me fight for you, she said. You already are. The hallway smelled like new paint and old fear. Kiara noticed it first, that sharp blend of bleach and bureaucracy that seemed to seep out from every crack in the polished floor. She walked half a step behind Ms. Evers, not out of deference, but because the woman moved like someone who still had something to protect. Pride, maybe, or principle. Or a classroom that was no longer hers. Everyone they passed looked up, and then away, as if their gaze had accidentally grazed something too painful to witness. Or maybe too inconvenient to confront. A woman in a red cardigan gave the faintest nod. A man near the vending machine didn't even pretend. Kiara saw it all. She was trained to. The room they were led to was small, windowless, clinical. The chairs were the kind designed to remind you not to stay too long. Across the table, Superintendent Beckman adjusted his tie as if that would make him look less guilty. Charis Lindholm, the district's legal counsel, smiled the way wolves probably smile before biting something soft. On the wall behind them, a framed quote read, "Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." Kiara wondered if anyone in the room had ever felt burned. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Beckman began. His voice sounded smooth by years of sidestepping accountability. We understand this has been a stressful week for everyone involved. Ms. Evers didn't speak. She just nodded, the way soldiers nod before battle. Charis cleared her throat and pushed a folder forward. Several complaints have come in, all related to your instruction around what parents are calling racially divisive content. History, Kiara said. You mean history? Perception is reality in education, Charis replied. No. Ms. Evers said quietly. Perception is fear. And fear is not the same as fact. There was a pause. It widened like a chasm between two worlds, one that taught children to think, and one that taught them to obey. Dana Collins, a 3rd grade art teacher and so-called witness, finally looked up from her coffee. Some of the kids said ... You made them feel bad about being white. Ms. Evers turned to her, steady and unflinching. I made them think. If that made them feel bad, perhaps that feeling is worth exploring, not suppressing. The room shifted. Beckman coughed. Charis scribbled something down that looked like damage control. And Kiara smiled, just a little. The press found them anyway. No matter how many side exits or back stairwells they took, there was always a camera. A microphone shoved in just close enough to catch a flinch. Double quotes. Ms. Evers, are you teaching CRT in elementary school? Is it true you said America is built on white supremacy? Do you regret telling students that whiteness has power? Each question came faster than the last, like knives thrown blindly. Ms. Evers didn't answer. Kiara did. Any further comments will come through legal counsel, she said. Her voice clipped like a gavel, but even silence became evidence in a world hungry for outrage. By the end of the week, the mailbox outside Ms. Evers' home was filled with letters. Some were anonymous, some not. Some called her a hero. Others called her worse. She opened one envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a drawing, crayon on notebook paper. A stick figure with dark skin stood in front of a chalkboard. Above it, in messy handwriting, "You made me feel like I." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. On Monday, the district announced that the Black History Month assembly had been canceled. No explanation. No apology. Just a calendar update, and a silence that screamed louder than any protest. When Kiara heard, she slammed her phone down and cursed. Ms. Evers just looked out the window. "They were afraid of one voice," she said. "So they silenced 100. That night, a group of fifth graders snuck back into school after hours. They papered the hallway with printouts of black inventors, poets, soldiers. They taped quotes to lockers. They hung a hand-drawn banner in the auditorium. "History is not an opinion." By morning, the janitors had taken it all down. But not before a photo went viral. Not before the world started asking questions. The district couldn't answer. The next meeting with the board was different. This time, they didn't meet in a small conference room. This time, they met in a chamber, lined with public seating, and those seats were full. Teachers, students, parents, reporters. And in the back row, a boy with red hair and freckles who once wrote an essay about Harriet Tubman, because Ms. Evers made her feel more real than Spider-Man. The board tried to control the narrative. They failed. A parent stood and shouted, "My daughter came home inspired, not ashamed." Another said, "If you're uncomfortable with the truth, maybe it's not the teacher who needs to change." And then a woman in her 60s, dressed in Sunday best, stood with a cane and trembling hands. "She taught my grandson," she said. "He used to stutter when reading. She told him his voice was worth hearing. Now he wants to be a lawyer." She turned to Kiara. "Is that your doing too?" Kiara blinked back tears. "No, ma'am. That was Ms. Evers." The backlash came fast and sharp. Kiara's email inbox was flooded. Threats, slurs, demands for disbarment. One message simply, "Read. You're everything wrong with this country. Enjoy burning with it." She forwarded it to the FBI, then made herself a cup of tea. "Ignore the noise," Ms. Evers said, sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through old lesson plans, like they were photos of a former life. "It's not noise," Kiara replied. "It's the sound of a dying lie screaming for air." Outside, a news van idled half a block away, waiting, watching, hoping for a breakdown, but there wouldn't be one, because some women don't break. They bend, they shift, they endure, until the moment comes to stand, and when they do, the ground remembers their weight. On the 6th day of suspension, Ms. Evers received a letter from a former student. The return address was a prison in Ohio. Inside was a 3-page note. The handwriting was rough, the grammar worse, but the heart in it, pure. "I still remember when you made us do that project on ancestors. I didn't have nobody. You told me to pick someone who inspired me instead. I picked you. I messed up later, but it ain't your fault. I just wanted to say, you mattered to me, even when I didn't matter to myself. If they fire you, they're not just firing a teacher. They're erasing a reason some of us kept going." Ms. Evers folded the letter carefully, then pressed it to her chest. Kiara didn't say anything. Some silences are sacred. 2 days later, Charis Lindholm sent an offer. Voluntary resignation. She called it, with a neutral reference and a modest severance. They offered silence, disappearance, a smooth vanishing act. Ms. Evers declined. With a smile and fire in her eyes, Kiara sat quietly in her bedroom, the soft glow of the desk lamp spilling over scattered notes and a worn student file she'd kept since 8th grade. On the bed lay an old photo of her standing beside Ms. Evers on middle school graduation day, both of them smiling. Kiara's smile was that of a child finally seen. Ms. Evers' smile carried the quiet strength of a woman who believed teaching was more than a job, it was a calling. Now, that same name, Ms. Evers, flashed across every TV screen, torn apart by pundits like she was some national threat. As if loving black children, believing in their brilliance, had become a crime. Critical race theory, they hissed. Dividing our children, poisoning their minds. Kiara clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to let that narrative win. Across town, Andre sat tucked into the corner of a small cafe, fingers scrolling through legal briefs on his tablet. He wasn't the shy kid anymore, the one afraid to raise his hand in class. Now he was a lawyer, a damn good one, and used to sparring with sharks in silk suits, the kind who shook your hand with one while stabbing you with the other. But this time, this wasn't just a case. This time, it was personal. They weren't just coming after a teacher. They were coming after memory, after truth, after justice itself. He flipped to another page. One name popped up again and again. Grant Holloway, current school board president. The same man who spoke calmly on national TV. We're not targeting Ms. Evers. We just want an education system that's neutral, free from ideology. Andre scoffed. He knew better. The people who preach neutrality the loudest are often the ones hiding the sharpest knives. 3 weeks earlier, just after the complaint was officially filed, Ms. Evers received a call in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end was gravely deliberate. You should have retired 5 years ago. You should have kept your mouth shut when you had the chance. She sat in the dark, frozen. That wasn't a parent. That was a ghost from a buried past, one she had locked away long ago, back in 2015, when Ms. Evers was a guidance counselor. At Lincoln West School District, she discovered something, nearly $400,000, quietly diverted from the district's equity and special needs funds. The signature on the transfer? Grant Holloway, then Assistant Director of Finance. She reported it internally, submitted the evidence through the secure channels. Weeks later, her direct supervisor was suddenly reassigned. The files vanished. Holloway? Promoted. Evers knew if she pushed further, it wouldn't just end her career, it would silence her permanently. And the hundreds of students who depended on her. They'd lose the only adult still willing to speak their names in the rooms that mattered. So she stayed quiet. And she carried that weight for nearly a decade. Now, that past had clawed its way back, dressed up as a moral prosecution. The next morning, Kiara was at the district library before the doors even unlocked. She had barely slept. Something about that photo, about the way Ms. Evers looked that day, had stuck with her like a whisper she couldn't quite make out. The library was old, the kind built before smartboards and security cameras. Kiara knew that Ms. Evers had once worked here, coordinating district-wide student equity programs. It was a long shot, but if anything had been left behind, this place was her only hope. The librarian was a woman in her 60s named Carla, whose salt and pepper curls seemed to know every whisper in those walls. When Kiara explained who she was, I was one of her students. Carla's expression softened. She helped my nephew get his GED, Carla said quietly, leading her toward a locked media room. I always wondered why she left so suddenly. Inside, it smelled like dust and secrets. Old filing cabinets lined the walls. In the back, on a shelf marked Archive District Projects, was a weathered cardboard box labeled Equity Fund, 2015. Kiara's hands trembled as she opened it. Among a pile of binders and evaluation forms was a silver external hard drive, still taped shut. Meanwhile, Andre was sitting in a law library, hunched over an old budget ledger from 2015. He'd used FOIA, requests to get access to district archives, and scanned through thousands of pages, searching for something, anything that didn't add up. And then he found it. 2 budget entries. Same date, same amount, same project code, but different destinations. One to a verified school equity initiative, the other a line item called Community Partnership Development, GH. GH, he murmured, Grant Holloway. It was textbook laundering funds diverted through a shell project with no actual beneficiaries listed. If this was true, it meant not only had Holloway misused public funds, but he had done it using the exact same programs he was now calling divisive. Andre closed the file and dialed Kiara. "Meet me at your place," he said. "We need to talk. Tonight." That evening, they sat across from each other at Kiara's kitchen table, the hard drive humming between them like it knew the storm it carried. She had plugged it in, unlocked it, and there it was, a folder labeled Red Flag Reports. Internal only. Inside were emails, time-stamped, from Ms. Evers to senior district officials. One in particular made Andre freeze. Subject: Unauthorized transfer of equity funds from Evers to Superintendent L. Strauss. Date: October 21, 2015. I am formally reporting a series of suspicious fund reallocations from the equity and inclusion programs. The transfers, totaling $397,600, were approved without council review or proper documentation. The primary signature on the release forms is Assistant Director Grant Holloway. Another email followed 2 weeks later. Subject: Follow up on whistleblower complaint from Evers to Ethics Oversight Board. No response received. Please advise on next steps. I fear retaliation. And Evers. Then nothing. Andre sat back. His mind was racing. This is it, he whispered. This is more than just wrongful termination. This is a cover-up. A decade-long lie. Kiara's voice shook. They painted her like she was dangerous, just for telling the truth. Andre looked at her, something hardening behind his eyes. We're not just defending her anymore, we're exposing them. At the same time, Grant Holloway sat in his office, watching the evening news. Community backlash continues to grow. The anchor reported, over 100 former students have signed a petition in support of Ms. Evers, demanding an independent review of her firing and curriculum. He muted the screen, poured himself a drink. He wasn't worried yet. He had buried that old scandal deep enough to choke it. Nobody had found the missing budget trail, and he was sure Ms. Evers had deleted everything after the school board's quiet threats. But then, an assistant burst into the room. You need to see this. She held up her phone. On screen, a local journalist's blog, just updated. Headline: Breaking. Leaked email suggests school board misused equity funds in 2015. Whistleblower was Ms. Evers. The blood drained from Holloway's face. Over the next 72 hours, the ripple became a wave. Former students of Ms. Evers, black, brown, white, Asian, began posting their stories on social media. Videos poured in. Some cried. Some raged. But all of them said the same thing: she changed my life. Hashtag Justice for Ms. Evers trended citywide. Then statewide. The district tried to issue a press release, but it only added fuel to the fire. The line that said, "We do not support educators who prioritize political ideologies over academic neutrality," felt like a slap to every student who remembered Ms. Evers staying after class, tutoring late, Buying books with her own money. Andre filed a motion to unseal the 2015 Equity Fund records. The school board resisted violently. They accused him of weaponizing unrelated past events and sabotaging community trust. But one night, a small envelope was slid under Kiara's apartment door. Inside, a copy of the internal ethics complaint Ms. Evers filed. A scanned resignation letter from a former board member, dated February 2016. A sticky note with one line, handwritten in shaking ink. He paid me $10,000 to stay quiet. Andre's breath caught. The signature on the letter? Jonathan Reyes, former chair of the Budget Oversight Committee. They tracked him down. Reyes lived alone in a modest house in the outskirts, now retired and unwell. When they arrived, he was hesitant, scared. But when Andre said the name Grant Holloway, the old man sat down hard. I told them I didn't want to be a part of it anymore, he murmured. I saw the reallocations. I knew they were wrong. But when I tried to go public, they threatened to pull my wife's health coverage. She died anyway. Cancer doesn't care about secrets. Reyes handed them a flash drive. This is all I kept, meeting notes, phone calls I recorded. They used students of color like bargaining chips. Andre and Kiara drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past like ghosts. At 2 a.m., Andre sat in front of his laptop, headphones in, listening to a crackly recording dated December 2015. Holloway's voice. Just make sure Evers keeps her mouth shut. She's idealistic, but she's not stupid. Give her a promotion. Or threaten her with reassignment to a low-performing school. Whatever keeps this off the books. Unidentified voice. And if she doesn't? Holloway. Then we bury her, publicly. We'll paint her as radical, unhinged. Let the media eat her alive. America doesn't need another angry black woman on the news. Andre paused, his chest heaved. His hands shook. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, narrative, power. The next day, the flash drive was handed to a federal attorney. Andre updated the civil suit into a class action complaint with criminal implications. Kiara published an article online titled, The Real Story Behind Ms. Evers, the Cover-Up, the Whistleblower, and the Students Who Remember. It went viral. The district tried to hold a press conference. Grant Holloway stood stiffly behind this podium, flanked by lawyers. His voice trembled beneath the weight of the nation's glare. And then, a single mother stepped forward from the crowd. My son has autism, she said into the mic. Miss Evers was the only teacher who ever believed in him. And you tried to silence her? The crowd erupted. That night, Holloway's office was raided under a federal subpoena. 2 other board members resigned. The superintendent issued a formal public apology. And Ms. Evers? She sat in her small home, alone, watching the news. For the first time in years, she wept not from defeat, but from vindication. She was no longer a villain. She was a mirror. And now, the whole world was finally willing to look. It was standing room only. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Journalists hunched over their notepads. Parents whispered behind cupped hands, and students from across the district leaned forward in their seats. The air was thick, not just with the weight of the case, but with the stifled history behind it. A black teacher accused of pushing an agenda, a former student turned attorney, and a school board with more skeletons than a graveyard. At the defense table, Andre adjusted his tie, his face a mix of fury and restraint. He had spent nights poring over depositions, reviewing transcripts, decoding internal emails that were meant to disappear. But this moment wasn't about paperwork. It was about something larger. It was about redemption. And then she walked in. Ms. Evers, wearing a modest navy dress, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Not a martyr, not a villain. Just a woman who had once believed teaching was sacred, and now found herself at the mercy of those who had long twisted truth. For power. As she took the stand, the prosecutor leaned forward with a smirk, voice laced with passive aggression. Ms. Evers, were you or were you not teaching ideas derived from critical race theory? Ms. Evers paused. And in that silence, time seemed to stretch. The air shifted, and across the aisle, Grant Holloway, now chairman of the board, gripped the armrest just a little tighter. This trial wasn't just about what was said in a classroom. It was about what had been hidden behind closed doors, and what was finally painfully about to come to light. It was standing room only. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Journalists hunched over their notepads. Parents whispered behind cupped hands, and students from across the district leaned forward in their seats. The air was thick, not just with the weight of the case, but with the stifled history behind it. A black teacher accused of pushing an agenda, a former student turned attorney, and a school board with more skeletons than a graveyard. At the defense table, Andre adjusted his tie, his face a mix of fury and restraint. He had spent nights poring over depositions, reviewing transcripts, decoding internal emails that were meant to disappear. But this moment wasn't about paperwork. It was about something larger. It was about redemption. And then she walked in. Ms. Evers, wearing a modest navy dress, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Not a martyr, not a villain. Just a woman who had once believed teaching was sacred, and now found herself at the mercy of those who had long twisted truth. For power. As she took the stand, the prosecutor leaned forward with a smirk, voice laced with passive aggression. Ms. Evers, were you or were you not teaching ideas derived from critical race theory? Ms. Evers paused. And in that silence, time seemed to stretch. The air shifted, and across the aisle, Grant Holloway, now chairman of the board, gripped the armrest just a little tighter. This trial wasn't just about what was said in a classroom. It was about what had been hidden behind closed doors, and what was finally painfully about to come to light. The room was too cold for comfort. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like anxious whispers. Ms. Evers sat at the witness stand, her palms pressed together on her lap, knuckles pale. Her eyes, though steady, carried a quiet storm, grief mixed with resolve. Across from her, the plaintiff's attorney, a man with a haircut too neat and a smile too polished, rose to his feet. He tapped his pen against the edge of the table like a metronome of smugness. Ms. Evers, he began, voice laced with artificial sweetness, would you please clarify for the court? Did you, or did you not, ever instruct your 8th grade class that America was founded on white supremacy? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ms. Evers didn't flinch. Her voice was soft but carried weight. I taught my students to think critically. We studied systems. We studied history, real history. I never told them what to believe. I taught them how to ask questions. The attorney smiled, feigned disappointment. So that's a yes. Andre stood up. Objection. Your Honor, that's a mischaracterization. Sustained, the judge said calmly, glancing toward the gallery where a few reporters scribbled in hushed excitement. But the damage was done. Ms. Evers' words had been twisted, as they always were, weaponized into the very lie they had come to dismantle. Andre inhaled slowly. His moment was coming, but it wasn't now. Timing was everything. The plaintiff's attorney strutted a few paces. And what about the assigned reading, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin? Several parents found it, let's say, inflammatory. Ms. Evers raised her chin. It's literature. And more than that, it's truth. You don't censor truth just because it makes you uncomfortable. The courtroom stirred again. It was then amidst the tension, as the air grew tight and sharp like glass, that something shattered. A sound, a small sob. Everyone turned. From the back of the courtroom, a woman with graying curls stood up, pressing a hand to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Excuse me. I have to say something, she whispered, barely audible. The judge frowned. Ma'am, but she kept going. I was one of Ms. Evers' students. Back in '89, I was the first girl in my family to graduate high school. She stayed after school with me for months so I could pass my GED. When my father died, she helped pay for my college applications. She saved my life. And now you're calling her dangerous? The room fell silent. Even the attorney lowered his hand. I became a nurse, the woman continued, her voice cracking. And I raised 2 sons. One of them's a teacher now. You think critical race theory is the problem? No, the problem is pretending that voices like hers don't belong in classrooms. She sat back down, sobbing quietly. Ms. Evers wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, but said nothing. Her silence in that moment was more powerful than any speech. Andre stepped forward. Now he thought. Now we begin. Andre stood slowly, unbuttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. He looked not at the judge, nor the plaintiff, but directly at the jury. 12 faces. 12 stories. And in this moment, 12 chances at truth. Ms. Evers, he said gently, stepping closer to the stand. Do you remember a student named Kiara Montgomery? A flicker of light in her eyes. Of course. What can you tell us about her? She was smart, curious, a bit shy but fiercely thoughtful. She asked hard questions. Questions some adults were too afraid to answer. Andre nodded. Do you recall why she missed nearly 2 months of school in spring semester? A pause. Ms. Evers took a breath. Her brother was killed in a police shooting. She stayed home to help her mother. Soft gasps scattered through the courtroom. Andre turned to the jury again. And during that time, did you visit her family, bring homework, tutor her outside of class? I did. Why? Because no one else did. Andre let the words hang in the air before continuing. Let's shift focus for a moment. Do you recognize this document? He held up a photocopy, grainy but unmistakable. He approached the bench and offered it to the judge, then handed one to opposing counsel. It's a 2015 budget summary from Lincoln West School District. Specifically, the allocation report for diversity and equity programs. The plaintiffs. Lawyer raised an eyebrow. Irrelevant. Let me finish, Andre said, voice sharper now. Ms. Evers, do you recognize the name that signed off on the withdrawal of nearly $400,000 from that fund? She stared at the document, then nodded solemnly. Grant Holloway. A murmur broke out louder this time. The judge banged the gavel. Order in the court. Andre stepped forward, voice rising like a tide. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about indoctrination. It isn't about protecting children from radical ideas. It's about silencing educators who ask us to look in the mirror. It's about power, money, and politics dressed up in concern for our kids. He turned to the gallery. It's about a board president who was nearly exposed 10 years ago, and is now weaponizing fear to bury the one woman who dared to speak up. Gasps, shifting in seats. The judge looked stunned, but didn't object. Andre continued, fierce now. You call this a culture war? I call it cowardice. He pointed toward the plaintiff's table. And you every time you say neutral education. What you mean is sanitized, whitewashed history. What you mean is, don't talk about slavery, don't talk about Jim Crow. Don't talk about why my client had to stay after school and buy pencils for kids who couldn't afford lunch. He turned to Ms. Evers. Final question. Would you do it all again? Tears welled up in her eyes, but her voice was steady. Every single day. The courtroom was still. One of the jurors, a middle-aged white woman, wiped her cheek. Another, a retired black veteran, gave a slow nod. Andre sat down. And in that moment, he knew the tide had shifted. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. Courtroom, day 14, 3:42 p.m. The air inside the courtroom was thick. The kind of stillness that only arrives before something irreversible. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder. Every seat was filled. Teachers, parents, students, some who hadn't stepped foot in a courtroom before now sat shoulder to shoulder. Ms. Evers sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly on her lap. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried once during this trial. Not when they twisted her curriculum into a political weapon, not when they dragged her name across headlines, and not even when they forced students to testify in fear. Andre stood beside her, tall and composed, but his knuckles were white. He had delivered his final argument with fire calm, yes, but sharp enough to slice through every lie. The jury had listened. They'd seen the receipts. They'd heard Ruben's recording. The judge entered. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged black woman in a gray blazer stood. She looked at Ms. Evers, then at the judge. We have your honor. The bailiff took the sealed paper and handed it up. The judge read it, silent. Then, in the matter of the People versus Claire Evers, we find the defendant not guilty on all counts. The room didn't erupt. Not at first. It was too sacred for that. Instead, it was a single clap from a man in the back row, then another. Then a rising sound of people standing. Not in protest, not in celebration. In honor, one by one. Every former student, some now wearing badges as police officers, some in scrubs, some holding babies of their own, stood tall. Kiara stood too, tears in her eyes. She didn't cry because Miss Evers had won. She cried because someone had finally said it out loud. You were never wrong for loving us. Miss Evers turned, eyes shimmering, as Andre leaned down. You're free, he whispered, but she shook her head, smiling softly. No, we are. 48 hours after the closing arguments, the heavy creak of the district school board's door echoed through the hallway like a gavel hitting wood. Inside the oak-paneled office, Grant Holloway sat behind his oversized mahogany desk, his navy blue suit crisp, his posture practiced. He still looked the part of a man in charge, but his eye twitched. His lips were dry. And he had just received the one message that could make everything fall apart. Someone had leaked the full financial audit from 2014 to 2018 to a local newspaper. And it wasn't just anyone. It was Ruben Mays, his former aide, the same man who once called him a moral compass for education. The same man who had now turned, with trembling hands and a voice cracking from guilt. In an audio recording sent anonymously to the Beacon, Ruben confessed, I used to believe in Grant. I thought he just wanted to keep things from falling apart. But then I saw it. He was the one personally authorizing transfers out of the Minority and Special Needs Student Fund. Where did it go? To a public image campaign for the board. Dinners with donors. Targeted Facebook ads about how the district cares. I even saw invoices paid to a private legal firm owned by his wife. There was a long pause in the recording. Ruben's voice dropped, barely above a whisper, like a man in the act of repentance. And when Ms. Evers filed an internal report, I was the one ordered to delete it from the system. The recording exploded across the media like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags trended. By the end of the day, over 12,000 signatures demanded that Grant Holloway be placed on immediate administrative leave. News crews swarmed outside the district office. As Holloway made his way to his black SUV, the questions came fast. Mr. Holloway, did you use district funds for personal gain? Why did you ignore concerns from the minority student community for so many years? Are you going to resign, sir? He didn't answer, just kept walking, but his face had lost all color. He looked like a man whose power had been peeled off him layer by layer until only fear remained. Fear and silence. Across town. Andre and Kiara sat in their favorite corner of the small cafe off Elm Street. The hum of the espresso machine in the background couldn't drown out the buzz of Kiara's phone. She scrolled through headline after headline. School board president under investigation for budget misuse. Former student and Attorney exposed the truth behind Ms. Evers' case. Andre took a sip from his coffee, then set the mug down, his smile slow and certain. They say justice is slow. But today, maybe it sprinted a little. Kiara looked up from her screen, her eyes gleaming. I've decided. I'm applying to Teachers College. Andre raised an eyebrow. She nodded, unwavering. I want to teach, like her. But this time, I won't stay quiet. The courtroom was empty now, rows of wooden benches echoing with the ghosts of gasps, murmurs, and stifled tears. The air still carried the faint smell of cheap cologne, coffee, and something else harder to name, a kind of exhaustion that comes after truth has been dragged into the light. Ms. Evers sat alone on the stand, long after the final gavel. The sun slanted through the tall windows, warming the mahogany floor at her feet. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Just breathe. Not victory, not relief. Just the simple act of breathing without a weight on her chest. Because though the verdict hadn't yet been read, the city had already begun to change. Across town, Kiara stood on a folding chair outside the district office. A makeshift podium sat in front of her, cobbled together from a few milk crates and a borrowed megaphone. Behind her stood dozens, no, hundreds of students. Black, brown, white. Teenagers with handmade signs. Parents holding the hands of younger children. Former teachers, neighbors, elders in lawn chairs, protesters, organizers, strangers, who had watched the hearing unfold and suddenly realized this wasn't just about one woman. It was about them too. Kiara's voice rang out, clear and fierce. She taught us that our voices mattered. She made us believe we belonged in rooms we weren't invited to. And when they tried to silence her, we remembered everything she ever taught us. Applause, cheers, chants began to rise. We stand with Evers. We stand with Evers. In a church basement 3 blocks away, Andre sat across from a round table of pastors, community leaders, and civil rights advocates. The walls were lined with fading photos, marks from the 60s, bus boycotts, sit-ins. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was strategy. Andre tapped the table with his pen. This is bigger than a courtroom. We need to demand oversight. Budget transparency. We need to file a civil review petition for every financial transfer in the last 10 years. Someone nodded. Another took notes. And the work began. Meanwhile, in households across the city, something else was happening. Conversations at dinner tables. Questions from kids that parents could no longer brush off. Why are people so mad about this teacher? What's critical race theory? Why did that man lie? The aftershocks had begun. Not violent, but relentless. Justice, real justice, rarely came with a drum roll. It came like water, seeping, softening, shifting the ground. And in that shifting, people moved. They rose. They stood. The rain had stopped, but the storm hadn't passed. 48 hours after the courtroom gasped at the leaked audio, Ms. Evers sat alone on a park bench, not far from her old school. The rusted swing sets creaked in the breeze. Across the street, the mural of Dr. King on the community center wall stood as tall and defiant as ever, watching over the neighborhood like a silent promise. She clutched a faded tote bag, filled with old lesson plans, handwritten notes from students, and one worn-out book, To Kill a Mockingbird. Her fingers traced the frayed cover. She used to read this with her 8th graders every spring. She used to believe that, like Atticus Finch, the system would protect the innocent. But now she wasn't sure anymore. Not after the headlines. Not after the threats. Not after the silence from people who used to call her hero. And yet, from the other side of the park, a young girl barely 10 walked up holding a crumpled sheet of paper. You're Ms. Evers, right? She nodded, unsure. My brother said you taught him how to write his first story. He said you told him he was more than his zip code. The girl handed her the paper. He's in college now. But I want to be a writer too. Ms. Evers looked down. It was a short story, written in looping, messy handwriting. About a girl who could talk to trees. About how the trees whispered the truth when no one else would. Tears welled in her eyes. Maybe it wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, Andre sat on the panel of a live town hall broadcast streamed across the state. The city council had agreed under public pressure to hold a community hearing about systemic discrimination in education. The gym was packed. Parents, teachers, former students, activists, even reporters, who once dismissed the case as a localized misunderstanding, now scrambled for camera angles. Andre's voice was calm, measured, but every word landed like a stone dropped in water. The truth, he said, was never about just one teacher. It was about every time a black student was told they were too angry for speaking up. Every time funding for special programs disappeared without explanation. Every time a school board smiled on camera while cutting resources behind the scenes. He paused, letting the room breathe. My name is Andre Michaels. I was one of those kids. I got lucky. But we shouldn't have to rely on luck to survive school. A slow clap started in the back. Then it built. The entire gym was on its feet. Applause that didn't feel like celebration, but defiance. Solidarity. At the same time, across the country, something unexpected was happening. Teachers from New York to Oakland began sharing their own stories under the hashtag #IST, and with Evers. One video showed a Latina teacher from Texas, her voice shaking. They told me not to talk about slavery unless it was balanced. They told me not to mention immigration unless I clarified both sides. I'm done being quiet. Another clip showed a white teacher from rural Ohio, holding up a stack of resignation papers. I've taught for 22 years. Today, I'm walking out in protest of a system that punishes those who love our kids too much. And then the students. Dozens of them, young and loud and brilliant. TikToks, Instagram Reels, live videos. One went viral. A black teenage boy from Alabama, standing in front of a closed classroom door. They suspended Ms. Jenkins last year for saying Black Lives Matter. They said it was too political, but me failing math every semester, that's just how it is. Nah, we're done. Back in Ms. Evers' neighborhood, something even more powerful took root. Sunday morning. The local church that had once debated whether to speak out now had its pews filled with people holding candles. Reverend Thompson stood at the pulpit, his deep voice echoing. Let it be known, he said, that silence is not spiritual. That justice is not optional. That truth-telling is not divisive, it is divine. He turned to Ms. Evers, seated in the front row. You gave this community more than lessons. You gave it light. The congregation stood. Some cried, some raised fists. Some just whispered, Amen. Meanwhile, Grant Holloway's world unraveled further. Documents continued to surface. Whistleblowers emerged. The local paper launched a multi-part series, The Holloway Files. The final blow came when the State Ethics Commission announced an investigation. Federal inquiries followed. The governor released a cautious statement calling for transparency and accountability at all levels. And then came the photo. It was simple. Just Holloway, standing in a hallway alone, head down, boxes in his arms. The caption read, School Board President resigns amid growing scandal. It spread like wildfire. Not because of joy, but because it looked like something rare. Accountability. In a quiet diner 2 blocks from the courthouse, Kiara and Andre sat across from each other. She was reading from her laptop. The district has agreed to reinstate Ms. Evers' full pension, issue a public apology, and review disciplinary procedures related to internal reporting. Andre leaned back. Still think justice doesn't sprint? Kiara smiled. No, I think sometimes it dances. She closed the laptop. I got into teachers' college. Full ride. I start in August. Andre beamed, then grew serious. They'll come for you, you know. Maybe not with lawsuits, but with silence, with indifference, with fatigue, she nodded. Then I'll teach them how to listen. And finally, on a Wednesday morning that smelled like rain and redemption, Ms. Evers stood in front of a classroom again, not to teach. Not yet, but to speak. It was career day at a local charter school. The students sat crisscross on the floor. Bright-eyed and jittery, she cleared her throat. People will tell you the truth is dangerous, that you should wait your turn to speak it. But if I've learned anything, she looked at Kiara, who was sitting in the back, now an intern. It's that the truth doesn't wait, and neither should you. When the classroom was taken back, a May morning, 5 weeks after the verdict, the first period bell rang through Meadowbrook High like a sacred summons. It no longer sounded like the tired chime of a broken system. Today, it felt like something holy, like the call to be seen, to be heard, and to belong. The old chalkboard had been replaced with a smart screen. But the most important change stood right in front of the class. Ms. Evers, reinstated. She walked into the room, her breath steady. No more tightly pinned hair. No more hesitant eyes behind a wall of politics. She walked like someone who had stepped through fire and returned with her soul intact. On the desk was a single sunflower. No name, just a folded slip of paper. Welcome back. We never stopped learning from you. She held the note, fingers trembling. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and rooted, like it was on her very first day teaching. History is not a list of dead events. History is the light we carry, so we don't stumble into darkness again. Across town, in the corner booth of the same cafe on Elm Street, a new chair had been added. Kiara, in a soft cream blouse, smiled as she spoke to 2 student teachers. On the table sat her lesson plan and a printed cover page that read, "Education is the voice of freedom." Andre entered, 2 coffees in hand like always. "Miss Kiara, got yourself a group of protégés now?" She smirked. "What else would you call me if not teacher?" He slid into the seat across from her, eyes glowing with quiet pride. "Yesterday, I got an email. A group of parents from another district wants to file suit against their own school board. They said, 'We read about Ms. Evers. We know now if we don't speak up, no one will.'" Elsewhere, Grant Holloway's office said empty. Only faint claw marks on the wall remained, where once hung a plaque reading, "For Distinguished Service to Educational Equity." Now it gathered dust in a storage room, forgotten. Outside, the questions hadn't stopped. How many students were abandoned? How many teachers were forced into silence? How many more years until equity is more than just a word? That evening, the Truth in the Classroom forum filled the city auditorium. Hundreds showed up. Not just teachers, parents, students, former students. People who had once believed their voices didn't matter. Ms. Evers took the stage. Andre stood just behind her. Kiara sat front row, holding the hand of a 12-year-old black girl, her mother recently fired for standing up against discrimination. Ms. Evers looked out at them all. No notes, no slides, no teleprompter. Just a voice. If you were ever silenced, if you ever saw something wrong and no one believed you, if you ever loved a classroom that betrayed you, then hear me now. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You are the truth that hasn't been honored yet. The applause cracked through the air like thunder. And in that moment, it wasn't just Evers, not just Andre, not just Kiara. It was everyone in that room who stood at the front of the class. Because when one person speaks up, a whole community rises. And when a classroom is reclaimed, no one learns in silence again. No one expected a small-town courtroom to spark a movement that would rattle the very pillars of public education. But a month after Ms. Evers returned to her classroom, 36 teachers from 12 different counties signed an open letter. It ran on the front page of the Beacon, not as a scream, but a steady voice that carried weight. We were told to Stay silent too. We watched our students pushed aside because someone decided they weren't worth the investment. But after watching Ms. Evers stand up, we realized we can't keep our heads down anymore. Something began to shift. School. Board meetings, once empty rituals that wrapped up in 20 minutes, were now standing room only. The air inside wasn't thick because of bad ventilation. It was the stories, the silence breaking, the grief that had waited too long to speak. Parents brought folders of transcripts. Students brought journals. Retired teachers brought tears that had long since dried. At a board meeting in Jefferson County, a 9th grade boy raised his ink-stained hand, hair freshly trimmed, voice trembling. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I got called slow just 'cause I didn't speak English as good as the other kids. And I know that ain't fair. The room froze. Then someone clapped. Then another. And then the whole room stood, not loud, but burning. The Evers bill 2 months after the verdict. Inside the state capitol building, Senator Elena Navarro stood to introduce a bill. Her voice calm but edged with history. Her mother had been fired from a teaching job in the 90s for speaking out. Long before hashtags or hidden cameras, the bill was called the Evers Act. It wasn't long, but it hit like thunder. An anonymous reporting system for abuse and misconduct in schools. A ban on retaliating against teachers, staff, or students who speak up. Mandatory transparency for all school board budgets. Student and parent representation in decision-making meetings. It didn't take long for lobbyists to fight back. Interest groups circled like vultures. But every time a reporter asked them why, the answer looped back to one moment: the Evers case. Clips replayed, quotes resurfaced. And the phrase, "You're not crazy, you're not weak," became a battle cry printed on shirts, posters, enamel pins. The movement grows at Meadowbrook. Students created a group called Student Voices Matter, a forum where teens could speak truth about tracking, discrimination, and the quiet hierarchy in their hallways. A 15-year-old girl stood up and said she was denied entry to honors classes because, as her counselor told her, "Your mom's a janitor. College might not be your path." At a public school in Minnesota, parents demanded the principal's resignation after it was exposed that he forced special ed students to stay home during standardized testing just to keep the school's scores high. In New York, a school board was suspended after it was discovered they had deliberately expelled low-performing students before testing season. To make the numbers shine, the fire was spreading fast. From classrooms to courtrooms, from schoolyards to Capitol floors. The fall of Holloway. Then it reached Grant Holloway. He had once graced the cover of American Education magazine, hailed as the face of Southern reform. But now, he was the face of something else. Indictments. 3 charges: embezzling public school funds, withholding internal misconduct reports, using his office for personal gain via a company linked to his wife, the star witness, Reuben Mays. His former aide, a man who'd stayed silent for years. When a journalist asked why he chose to speak now, Reuben didn't hesitate. "I was scared, but then I saw a teacher stand alone in court, and I knew it was time to stop running." Ms. Evers today, she didn't go back to room 214. Not the way she used to. Now, Ms. Evers teaches future educators. Fresh minds, open hearts, most of them hopeful. Some of them wary. All of them watching her closely. On the first day of the new program, she didn't pass out syllabi. She didn't play an icebreaker game. She just asked one question: if a student's being bullied for being poor, do you still teach the chapter on good citizenship like nothing happened? They laughed, then went silent, not because they didn't know the answer, but because, in that moment, they understood. That wasn't a lesson. It was a crossroads. Andre's voice one fall evening, in the auditorium of a local law school, a familiar figure stepped on stage. It was Andre, now a TEDx speaker. Still soft-spoken. Still razor-sharp. Dressed in a modest suit. Holding a microphone like it was a matchstick. He looked out at the crowd and said, "I used to think changing the system took power. Now I know it takes courage, and courage isn't yelling. It's standing there, completely alone, and refusing to back down." Replanting the roots of education, the school sat at the far end of a street most people ignored. It used to be a vocational training center, long abandoned. The brick walls were faded and chipped, the backyard overrun with weeds. But on a quiet April morning, with sunlight pushing through dusty windows, a small group of people unlocked the front door again. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press coverage. Just a hand-painted wooden sign out front, Freedom School. The name wasn't chosen lightly. Andre picked it. He said if the old system had forgotten anything, it was this: the freedom to learn in a way that felt true. Ms. Evers nodded. She understood. It started with 17 students. Some were children of parents who had spoken up at board meetings. Some had been labeled problem kids at their former schools. One didn't speak for an entire week. Another only communicated through drawings. But no one was asked to fit in. There were no uniforms. No bells. No standardized tests. Every week began with a question, not a curriculum. What do you want to understand this week? At first, most kids stayed quiet. A few asked things not found in textbooks. Why do grown-ups break promises? Why do they call me special just because I need more time? One morning, Andre wrote a question on the board. If school were a place for healing, what would it look like? Lonnie, a quiet girl who had been kicked out of 3 schools for lack of focus, raised her hand. Her voice was soft but steady. "I think no one would compare me to anyone else. And if I cried, they wouldn't tell me I was being disruptive." The room fell silent. Not out of sadness, but because someone had finally named what everyone else had been holding in, building something good inside. A system not ready for good, that was never going to be easy. 3 months in, they got a letter from the district, requesting a formal review of their model's compliance. The language was polite, but the tone reeked of warning. An official arrived with sample report cards and standardized test forms. He was invited to sit in on a class. One student was explaining climate change to a peer using a Lego model the kids had built themselves. The official said nothing. He watched, then left. The next week, the school received a notice. Freedom School was ineligible for public funding. Miss Evers held the paper, her lips curling in a quiet smirk. Ineligible? She whispered. Or just too unruly to be controlled? Some parents panicked. A few pulled their children out. And that was okay. Everyone has their limits. But others stayed. One single mother stood up during a community meeting and said, "I don't need a perfect school. I just need a place where my child doesn't have to lower his head every morning he walks out the door." To survive, they improvised. Outdoor classrooms. Community fairs. A skill-sharing network. Someone taught cooking, another woodworking, another how to write college essays. Andre led a class called Speech and Communication. But he didn't assign the Gettysburg Address. He began with a question: when no one listens to you, what would you say to make them stop and hear? That fall, an indie filmmaker from Boston heard whispers about Freedom School. She arrived with a handheld camera and a genuine sense of curiosity. At first, the team said no to filming. They were afraid of being misunderstood, but Lonnie, now a little taller and braver, put her hand on Ms. Evers' shoulder and said, "If people don't see this, how will they know there's another way?" And so the camera rolled. 1 year after opening, the students wrote a book. The title, We're Not Broken, We're Becoming. There were no chapters, just voices, stories, questions. One student wrote, "I am not my test score." Another, "I want to be Ms. Evers, but for math." For the book release, They held a reading outdoors. No stage, no backdrop. Just a blanket on the grass, some paperbacks, and a small crowd listening in the late afternoon light. At the end, Ms. Evers sat beside Andre. The wind carried the sound of laughter, of children whispering dreams into the trees. "We're not going to change the whole world," she said quietly. Andre nodded. "But maybe," she added, "we're planting a few stubborn seeds. That just might crack through stone. Maybe they won't change the whole system. Maybe they're just a small flame in a long cold storm. But like Ms. Evers said, we're planting seeds stubborn enough to grow through stone." If this story made you pause for a second, or made you think about someone who was once labeled as a problem, I hope you'll subscribe, not for the algorithm, but because stories like this deserve to keep living through people willing to listen. Thanks for being one of them.